The dust cloud rising from the cattle drive could be seen for miles across the Nevada desert, and Marion Wells knew she was running out of time to prove herself before someone noticed she could barely lift the water buckets anymore. She had been working at the cattle ranch outside Tonopah for 3 weeks now, and every day her arms ached more, her back screamed louder, and the foreman's suspicious glances grew longer. It was 1882, and jobs for women were scarce enough without adding failure to her reputation. She needed this work desperately. Her father had died 6 months ago in a mining accident, leaving her alone with debts that threatened to swallow what little remained of their homestead. The morning sun beat down mercilessly as Marion struggled with a fence post, trying to hammer it into the hard Nevada ground. Sweat dripped into her eyes, blurring her vision, and her arms trembled with each swing of the heavy mallet. "Miss Wells." The foreman's voice came from behind her, stern and disapproving. Marion turned, wiping her brow with the back of her hand. Harold Preston stood with his arms crossed, his weathered face set in hard lines. He was a fair man by most accounts, but he had no patience for workers who could not pull their weight. "Yes, sir. I have been watching you these past weeks," Preston said, his tone matter of fact. "You are a hard worker, I will give you that. You show up early, you stay late, and you never complain." Marion felt her heart sink. She knew what was coming next. "But you are too weak for this kind of hard work," Preston continued, shaking his head. "You can barely manage the water barrels, and I have seen you struggling with loads half the size of what the other hands carry. I cannot keep you on when we need people who can handle the physical demands of ranch work." "Please, Mr. Preston," Marion said, hating the desperation in her voice. "I can learn, I can get stronger, I just need more time. I have given you 3 weeks. That is more than fair." Preston's expression softened slightly. "You are a decent person, Miss Wells, but this is not the right place for you. I will pay you through the end of the week. After that, you need to find work elsewhere." Marion watched him walk away, her vision blurring with tears she refused to let fall. She had nowhere else to go. The debts her father left behind had forced her to sell almost everything they owned. This job was supposed to be her salvation, her chance to earn enough to keep the small piece of land that was all she had left of her family. She finished her shift in a daze, her mind racing through impossible scenarios. By the time the sun began to set, painting the Nevada sky in shades of orange and purple, Marion had made up her mind. She would go into the mountains. There were stories of trappers and mountain men who sometimes traded in Tonopah, rough men who lived off the land and had no use for the rules of civilized society. Perhaps she could find work with one of them. Cooking or mending or doing whatever tasks did not require the brute strength she lacked. The next morning, before dawn broke over the desert, Marion packed her few belongings into a worn canvas bag. She left a note for the landlady at the boarding house where she rented a tiny room, explaining that she was seeking work elsewhere and would return to settle her account when she could. Then she set out on foot toward the mountains that rose in the distance, their peaks still dusted with the last of winter's snow, despite the heat of the approaching summer. The walk was longer than she expected. By midday, the town of Tonopah had disappeared behind her, swallowed by the endless expanse of sagebrush and desert. The mountains seemed to grow no closer no matter how long she walked. Her water canteen was already half empty, and she began to wonder if she had made a terrible mistake. As the afternoon sun reached its peak, Marion spotted a thin trail of smoke rising from somewhere ahead. Her heart lifted. Smoke meant people, and people meant the possibility of help. She adjusted her bag on her shoulder and pressed forward, ignoring the blisters forming on her feet and the way her legs trembled with exhaustion. The source of the smoke was a cabin nestled in a small canyon where a creek cut through the rocky terrain. It was a sturdy structure, built from logs that had been carefully fitted together, with a stone chimney from which the smoke rose. A corral held 3 horses, and Marion could see animal pelts stretched on frames in the yard. This was the home of a trapper, she realized, exactly the kind of person she had hoped to find. She approached slowly, uncertain of her reception. Mountain men had a reputation for being solitary and sometimes hostile to strangers, but she had come too far to turn back now. Before she reached the cabin door, it swung open. The man who emerged was the largest human being Marion had ever seen. He stood well over 6 feet tall, with shoulders so broad they nearly filled the doorway. His chest and arms were thick with muscle, visible beneath his worn shirt. Dark hair fell past his shoulders, tied back loosely, and a thick beard covered the lower half of his face. His eyes were a startling blue, sharp and assessing as they fixed on Marion. "You are a long way from town," he said. His voice was deep, with a rough quality that suggested he did not use it often. Marion straightened her spine, trying to project a confidence she did not feel. "I am looking for work, sir. I can cook, clean, mend clothes, and tend to household tasks. I do not require much in the way of wages, just enough to earn my keep and save a little." The mountain man studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. "What is your name?" "Marion Wells." "Kade Thorne." He gestured toward the cabin. "You look like you are about to fall over. Come inside and have some water. Then you can tell me why a woman from Tanapa is wandering alone in the mountains looking for work." Marion followed him into the cabin, grateful for the shade and the relative coolness inside. The interior was sparse but clean, with a large stone fireplace, a sturdy table and chairs, a bed in one corner, and shelves lined with supplies. Kade poured water from a bucket into a tin cup and handed it to her. She drank deeply, the cool water soothing her parched throat. When she lowered the cup, she found Kade watching her with those intense blue eyes. "Now," he said, settling into a chair that creaked under his weight, "tell me your story." Marion hesitated, then decided that honesty was her best option. She told him about her father's death, the debts, her failed attempt to work at the cattle ranch. She explained that the foreman had said she was too weak for hard labor and that she had nowhere else to turn. Kade listened without interruption, his face giving away nothing of his thoughts. When she finished, silence filled the cabin. "The foreman was right," Kade finally said, and Marion's heart sank. "You are not built for heavy ranch work, but that does not mean you are weak." Marion looked up at him, surprised. "Strength shows in different ways," Kade continued. "Takes strength to walk into these mountains alone. Takes strength to keep going when everything falls apart." He stood, moving to look out the window at his small homestead. "I could use help around here. Cooking, as you said. Mending. I spend most of my time trapping and hunting, and I come back to find my clothes falling apart and nothing but dried meat and beans to eat. If you are willing to work, I can offer you room and board and a small wage. You can sleep in the loft. I will give you your privacy, and I expect the same in return." Marion could hardly believe what she was hearing. "You would hire me, just like that," Kade said. "But I need to know you are serious. Life up here is not easy. Winters are hard and we are miles from town. If you cannot handle it, I need to know now." "I can handle it," Marion said firmly. "I promise you, Mr. Thorne, I will work harder than anyone you have ever known." A hint of something that might have been a smile touched Kade's bearded face. "Just Kade, and we will see about that promise. You can start by making supper. There is venison in the cold storage, vegetables in the root cellar, and flour and other supplies on the shelves. Show me what you can do." Marion set to work with a will, grateful to have a task she knew she could accomplish. She found the cold storage, a small underground room where the temperature stayed cool even in summer, and retrieved the venison. The root cellar yielded potatoes, carrots, and onions. Within an hour, she had a stew bubbling over the fire, filling the cabin with rich, savory aromas. She mixed biscuit dough and set it to bake in the Dutch oven, and she even found some dried apples that she stewed with a bit of sugar and cinnamon. Kade had gone out to tend to his horses and check his traps, but he returned as the sun was setting. The expression on his face when he saw the meal laid out on the table was worth every moment of effort. "When did you last have a proper meal?" Marion asked, as she watched him eat with an enthusiasm that suggested it had been quite some time. "Cannot remember," Kade admitted. He finished his first bowl of stew and helped himself to seconds. "This is good. Real good." Marion felt a warm glow of satisfaction. This was something she could do well, something that mattered. For the first time since her father's death, she felt like she had found solid ground beneath her feet. The days that followed established a rhythm. Kade would wake before dawn and head out to check his trap lines, sometimes disappearing into the mountains for hours at a time. Marion would wake shortly after and begin her tasks. She cleaned the cabin from top to bottom, organized the supplies, mended every piece of clothing that needed repair, and prepared 3 solid meals a day. She tended the small garden plot behind the cabin, pulling weeds and watering the vegetables that grew there. She learned to smoke meat and tan hides, tasks that Kade showed her with surprising patience. In the evenings, they would sit by the fire, and Kade would tell her stories of his life in the mountains. He had been trapping for 8 years, he told her, since he was 20 years old. He had come west from Missouri after his parents died, looking for a life away from the crowded cities and the expectations of polite society. He loved the solitude of the mountains, the challenge of living off the land, the freedom of answering to no one but himself. Marion found herself drawn to him in ways she had not expected. She admired his self-sufficiency, his quiet competence, the way he moved through the world with complete confidence in his own abilities. She noticed the way his muscles flexed when he chopped wood, the way his hands, so large and rough, could be surprisingly gentle when he was working with a delicate trap mechanism or treating an injured horse. She noticed the rare smiles that softened his bearded face, the kindness in his eyes when he taught her something new. One morning, about a month after Marion had arrived, she was working in the garden when she heard Kade shout from the direction of the creek. She dropped her tools and ran toward the sound, her heart pounding with alarm. She found Kade kneeling beside the water, and for a moment she thought he had been injured. Then she saw what he was looking at. A young deer, barely more than a fawn, lay on its side in the shallow water, its leg caught in a tangle of old fishing line and debris. The animal was exhausted from struggling, its eyes rolling with fear. "Hold its head," Kade said quietly. "Keep it calm while I cut it free." Marion waded into the creek without hesitation, kneeling in the cold water and laying gentle hands on the deer's head. She murmured soft, soothing words, the same kind of nonsense she used to whisper to her father's old dog when it was frightened. The deer trembled beneath her touch but stopped struggling. Kade worked quickly, his large hands surprisingly deft as he carefully cut away the fishing line without injuring the animal further. When the deer was free, he lifted it easily and carried it to the bank, setting it down in the grass. The leg was scratched but not seriously injured. "Will it be all right?" Marion asked, still stroking the deer's head. "Should be. Might be stiff for a few days, but nothing is broken." Kade sat back on his heels, watching Marion with an expression she could not quite read. "You are good with animals. You did not even hesitate to help," Of course not. The poor thing was suffering. Most people from town would have been afraid to get that close to a wild animal. I am not most people, I suppose, Marion said with a small smile. The deer suddenly stirred, finding its strength. Marion stepped back quickly and the animal scrambled to its feet. It stood for a moment, looking at them with large, liquid eyes, then bounded off into the brush. That was something, Kade said softly. They walked back to the cabin together, their shoulders nearly touching on the narrow path. Marion was acutely aware of his presence beside her, the warmth radiating from his large frame, the earthy scent of leather and pine that clung to him. That evening, as they sat by the fire after supper, Kade seemed quieter than usual. Marion worked on mending one of his shirts, trying to focus on her stitches instead of the way the firelight played across his features. "Marion," he said suddenly, breaking the comfortable silence. She looked up. "Yes, I want you to know that you have earned your place here. You are not just earning your keep, you have made this place a home." He paused, seeming to struggle with his words. "I did not realize how lonely I was until you came." Marion's heart began to beat faster. "I feel the same way. I have been happier here in these past weeks than I have been in a long time." Kade met her eyes across the fire. "I am not good with words. I have spent too many years alone, talking to nobody but myself and the animals. But I need you to know that I value you. Not just for the work you do, but for who you are." "Kade," Marion whispered, setting aside her mending. He stood and crossed to where she sat, kneeling down so their faces were level. This close, she could see the different shades of blue in his eyes, the silver starting to thread through his dark hair and beard. "I know I am rough," he said, his deep voice barely above a murmur. "I know I am not the kind of man a woman like you would normally choose. But I care about you, Marion, more than I have cared about anyone in a long time." Marion reached out and placed her hand against his bearded cheek. "You are exactly the kind of man I would choose. You are strong and kind and honest. You saw value in me when everyone else saw only weakness." "How could I not care for you?" The kiss, when it came, was gentle despite his size and strength. His lips were soft beneath his beard, and his hand cradled the back of her head with infinite tenderness. Marion felt something inside her chest unfurl like a flower opening to the sun. This was right. This was where she belonged. When they finally pulled apart, Kade rested his forehead against hers. "I want to do this properly. I know we have not known each other long, but out here, time moves differently. I know my heart, and my heart says you are the one I have been waiting for." "My heart says the same thing," Marion replied, her voice thick with emotion. "Then will you marry me, Marion Wells? Will you be my wife, share this life with me, build a future together?" "Yes," Marion said, tears spilling down her cheeks. "Yes, I will marry you, Kade Thorne." They held each other for a long time, the fire crackling beside them, the mountain night wrapping around the cabin like a blanket. Marion had come to the mountains looking for work, for survival, for a way to keep going. She had found so much more. She had found home. She had found love. The next morning, they rode together into Tanapa. It was Marion's first trip back to town since she had left, and she felt like a different person. The weight of worry and desperation that had pressed down on her shoulders was gone, replaced by a lightness she had not felt since before her father died. They stopped first at the land office, where Marion signed over the deed to her father's homestead. The small plot was barely worth anything, but the money from the sale was enough to pay off the remaining debts. It hurt to let go of the last piece of her old life, but Marion knew it was the right choice. Her future was with Kade now in the mountains, not in the desert trying to make something grow from dust and loss. Next, they visited the small church at the edge of town. The minister, Reverend Davies, was an elderly man with kind eyes and a gentle manner. He listened to their request to be married and smiled warmly. "I would be honored to perform the ceremony," he said. "Though I must ask, are you certain? You have known each other only a short time." "I am certain," Marion said firmly, looking at Kade. "More certain than I have ever been about anything." "As am I," Kade added, his deep voice resonating in the small church. "Then we will hold the ceremony tomorrow afternoon," Reverend Davies said. "That will give you time to find witnesses and make whatever preparations you wish." They spent the rest of the day in town, buying supplies and spreading word of the upcoming wedding. Marion was surprised by how many people came up to congratulate them. She had thought her brief time in Tanapa had made little impression, but several women from the boarding house came to hug her and wish her well. Even the foreman, Harold Preston, tracked them down to offer his good wishes. "I heard you found a place in the mountains," Preston said, shaking Kade's hand. "I am glad. I felt badly about letting you go, Miss Wells, but I see now it worked out for the best." "It did," Marion agreed, smiling up at Kade. "Everything worked out exactly as it was meant to." That evening they stayed in town at the hotel, occupying separate rooms to observe propriety for one final night. Marion lay awake for a long time, watching moonlight spill through the window and thinking about the strange turns life could take. 6 weeks ago, she had been desperate and alone, facing a future that seemed bleak and hopeless. Now she was hours away from marrying a man she loved, starting a new life in the mountains. The wedding the next day was simple but beautiful. Marion wore a dress she had purchased that morning, a pale blue cotton that matched her eyes. Kade had gotten a haircut and trimmed his beard, and he wore new clothes that strained slightly across his muscular frame. Several townspeople attended, curious to see the unlikely couple. The landlady from Marion's former boarding house stood as witness, along with the blacksmith who had befriended Kade during his trading trips to town. When Reverend Davies asked Kade if he took Marion to be his wife, his "I do" rang out clear and strong, echoing in the small church. Marion's own voice shook with emotion as she made her vows, but she spoke them clearly, wanting Kade to hear the certainty in every word. "I now pronounce you man and wife," Reverend Davies declared. "You may kiss your bride." Kade cupped Marion's face in his large hands and kissed her with a tenderness that made her heart swell. The small congregation applauded, and Marion felt tears of joy streaming down her face. They celebrated with a meal at the town's restaurant, joined by the witnesses and a few other friends. The food was good and the company was warm, but Marion found herself eager to return to the mountains, to begin their married life in earnest. As the sun began to set, they mounted Kade's horses and headed back toward the cabin. The ride seemed shorter this time, perhaps because Marion's heart was so full she barely noticed the passing miles. When the cabin finally came into view, nestled in its small canyon with smoke rising from the chimney that Kade had banked before they left, Marion felt a profound sense of homecoming. Kade helped her down from her horse, and for a moment they simply stood together, his arms around her waist, looking at their home. "Welcome home, Mrs. Thorne," he said softly. "I like the sound of that," Marion replied, leaning back against his broad chest. That night, they consummated their marriage with a passion and tenderness that left Marion breathless. Kade was gentle despite his size and strength, careful not to hurt her, attentive to her every response. Afterward, they lay tangled together in the bed, Marion's head resting on Kade's chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. "I never thought I could be this happy," she whispered into the darkness. "Neither did I," Kade replied, his fingers tracing lazy patterns on her shoulder. "I thought I was content alone, but now I know I was just waiting for you." The months that followed were the happiest of Marion's life. She and Kade fell into an easy partnership, each complementing the other's strengths. While Kade spent his days trapping and hunting, Marion managed the homestead with increasing skill and confidence. She expanded the garden, preserved food for the coming winter, and even learned to tan hides well enough that Kade could trade them in town for top prices. But it was not just the work that bound them together. It was the quiet evenings by the fire, the conversations that ranged from practical matters to dreams and memories. It was the way Kade would come home from a long day in the mountains, and his entire face would light up when he saw her. It was the way Marion's heart still skipped a beat when she heard his footsteps on the porch. It was the laughter they shared, the challenges they faced together, the slowly deepening understanding that they had found in each other a partner for life. As autumn painted the mountains in shades of gold and crimson, Marion realized she had not had her monthly courses in some time. At first, she thought it was simply the change in her circumstances, the different food and activity level. But as the weeks passed and other signs appeared, she could no longer deny what was happening. She was pregnant. Marion waited until she was certain before telling Kade. One evening in late October, as they finished supper, she reached across the table and took his hand. "Kade, I have something to tell you." He looked up from his plate, his blue eyes immediately alert. "What is it? Is something wrong?" "Nothing is wrong," Marion said quickly. "In fact, something is very right. Kade, I am going to have a baby. We are going to have a baby." For a moment, Kade simply stared at her, his expression frozen. Then, slowly, a smile spread across his face, growing wider until he was grinning like Marion had never seen before. He stood so quickly his chair fell over, came around the table and swept her up into his arms, spinning her around the cabin. "A baby," he said, his voice filled with wonder. "Marion, we are going to have a baby." "Careful," Marion laughed, clinging to his shoulders. "Put me down before you make me dizzy." He set her down gently, immediately becoming solicitous. "Are you all right? Do you need to sit down? Should you be working so hard?" "I am fine," Marion assured him. "Women have babies all the time, Kade. I am not fragile." But Kade insisted on taking over more of the physical tasks around the homestead, refusing to let Marion lift anything heavy or overexert herself. It was sweet, if sometimes frustrating. Marion understood it came from love, from the same protectiveness that had drawn her to him in the first place. As winter closed in around the mountains, Marion and Kade prepared for both the harsh season and the baby's arrival. They reinforced the cabin against the cold, stocked the root cellar and cold storage with enough food to last until spring, and gathered a massive supply of firewood. Marion sewed tiny clothes from soft fabric they purchased on a trip to Tanapa, and Kade built a beautiful wooden cradle, each piece carved and smoothed with loving care. The winter was hard, as Kade had warned. Snow piled high around the cabin, and there were days when the wind howled so fiercely they could barely hear each other speak. But inside, they were warm and safe. Marion's belly grew round, and Kade would often place his large hand against it, his eyes widening with wonder every time he felt the baby move. "Strong little thing," he would say with pride. "Takes after his mother." "Or her father," Marion would counter, smiling. "Either way, this child has good stock," Kade would reply, pulling Marion close. On a snowy March morning in 1883, Marion went into labor. Kade had brought a midwife from Tanapa to stay with them for the last few weeks of the pregnancy, an older woman named Ruth, who had delivered half the babies in the county. Ruth took charge immediately, sending Kade to boil water and stay out of the way, while she helped Marion through the long hours of labor. Kade tried to follow instructions, but Marion could hear him pacing like a caged bear just outside the bedroom door. During a brief lull, she called out to him. "Kade, I am all right. Stop worrying." "I cannot help it," his deep voice called back. "I have faced down bears and mountain lions, but nothing has ever scared me like this." Despite the pain, Marion smiled. "The baby and I are going to be fine. Ruth knows what she is doing." And Ruth did. As the afternoon sun began to slant through the windows, Marion gave one final push and heard the most beautiful sound in the world, her baby's first cry. "It is a boy," Ruth announced, wrapping the infant in a clean blanket and placing him in Marion's arms. "A big, healthy boy." Marion looked down at her son, overwhelmed by the rush of love that filled her. He had a shock of dark hair and tiny, perfect features. His eyes were squeezed shut and his little fists waved in the air as he cried. "Kade," Marion called. "Kade, come meet your son." The door opened immediately and Kade entered, his eyes wide and his face pale. He crossed to the bed slowly, as if afraid he might break something. When he looked down at the baby in Marion's arms, his expression transformed into something so tender and full of love that Marion felt tears spill down her cheeks. "He is perfect," Kade whispered, reaching out one large finger to gently touch the baby's tiny hand. Immediately, the infant's fingers wrapped around his father's finger, holding on tight. Kade made a choked sound and Marion saw tears tracking down his bearded face. "He is so small, so perfect." "You want to hold him?" Marion asked. Kade looked terrified at the prospect, but he nodded. Marion showed him how to support the baby's head, and then their son was cradled in his father's massive arms, looking impossibly tiny against Kade's broad chest. "Hello, little one," Kade murmured. "I am your papa, and I promise you I will always keep you safe. I will teach you everything I know. I will love you every day of your life." Marion watched them together, her heart so full she thought it might burst. This was her family. This was the life she had built from the ashes of loss and desperation. "What should we name him?" she asked. Kade looked up at her, his blue eyes shining. "What about Kenneth? Kenneth Thorne. We could call him Ken." "Kenneth Thorne," Marion repeated, testing the name. "I love it. Hello, Kenneth. Welcome to the world." The months that followed were exhausting and wonderful in equal measure. Kenneth was a healthy baby with strong lungs and his father's hearty appetite. Marion fed him and cared for him while Kade hovered nearby, constantly worried and endlessly fascinated by his son. The first time Kenneth smiled, Kade nearly fell over with excitement. The first time he laughed, a burbling baby sound that filled the cabin with joy. Both parents stood and applauded as if he had accomplished some great feat. As Kenneth grew from infant to baby, Marion found herself settling even more deeply into her role as wife and mother. But she also discovered that she had not lost herself in these roles. She was still the woman who had walked into the mountains alone, still the person who found strength in unexpected places. She learned to hunt small game when Kade was away for extended periods. She became skilled at reading the weather and the seasons, knowing when to harvest and when to plant. She made friends with other mountain families they occasionally encountered, creating a network of neighbors who looked out for one another across the vast distances. One summer evening, when Kenneth was about 18 months old and toddling around the cabin with the fearless energy of all young children, Marion and Kade sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant colors. "You ever regret it?" Kade asked suddenly. Marion looked at him in surprise. "Regret what? This life, the mountains, being married to a rough mountain man instead of someone from town who could give you an easier life." Marion reached over and took his hand. "Kade Thorne, I regret nothing. This life is not always easy, but it is real and it is ours. You are not just some rough mountain man. You are my husband, the father of my son, my partner, and the love of my life. You saw strength in me when everyone else saw only weakness. You gave me a chance when I had nowhere else to turn." "How could I possibly regret that?" Kade squeezed her hand, his expression softening. "I am the one who should be grateful. You took this empty cabin and made it a home. You took my solitary life and filled it with love and laughter. You gave me Kenneth. You gave me everything." From inside the cabin came a crash, followed by Kenneth's wail. Marion and Kade both jumped up and hurried inside, where they found their son sitting on the floor, surrounded by the wooden blocks Kade had carved for him. He was not hurt, just frustrated that his tower had fallen down. Kade scooped him up, and Kenneth's cries immediately turned to giggles as his father tossed him gently in the air. Marion watched them play, her heart full of contentment. The years passed, bringing changes and challenges but also deep joy. Kenneth grew into a sturdy boy with his father's dark hair and his mother's thoughtful nature. He learned to help around the homestead, following Kade into the mountains and learning the skills of trapping and hunting, while also spending time with Marion in the garden and kitchen, learning those skills as well. When Kenneth was 4, Marion became pregnant again. This time, the process felt easier, perhaps because she knew what to expect. In the spring of 1887, she gave birth to a daughter they named Margaret, after Marion's mother. Margaret was smaller than Kenneth had been, with wisps of reddish hair and bright, curious eyes. Kenneth was fascinated by his baby sister, always wanting to hold her and help care for her. "Gentle," Marion would remind him, and Kenneth would carefully cradle his sister, his young face serious with concentration. The cabin began to feel crowded with 4 of them, so Kade spent a summer building an addition, expanding their home to include a separate room for the children. He also built a larger barn and expanded the corral, as they now had more horses and a few cattle. The homestead was thriving, growing into a real ranch. Marion sometimes thought about the woman she had been when she first arrived in these mountains, desperate and uncertain, convinced she had no value because she could not do heavy labor. She barely recognized that woman now. She had found her strength, not in trying to match physical power she did not possess, but in embracing the skills and qualities she had. She had built a home, raised children, created a life of substance and meaning. One autumn afternoon, when Kenneth was 10 and Margaret was 6, a familiar face appeared at their homestead. Harold Preston, the foreman who had dismissed Marion all those years ago, rode up on horseback, looking considerably older and more weathered than Marion remembered. "Mr. Preston," Marion said, greeting him with surprise. "What brings you all the way up here?" Preston dismounted, removing his hat. "Mrs. Thorne, I hope you will forgive the intrusion. I heard about your ranch up here and I wanted to see it for myself." He looked around at the neat homestead, the well-tended garden, the sturdy buildings. "I also wanted to apologize." "Apologize?" Marion echoed, confused. "For telling you that you were too weak for ranch work all those years ago. I was wrong, Mrs. Thorne. I only saw one kind of strength. I did not recognize that there were other ways to be strong, other skills that matter just as much as being able to lift heavy loads. Looking at what you have built here, I can see that clearly now." Marion felt a tightness in her chest ease, a knot she had not even realized was still there. "Thank you, Mr. Preston. That means more than you know." Kade emerged from the barn and Marion introduced the 2 men. They shook hands and Preston complimented Kade on his fine homestead and family. "Your wife is a remarkable woman," Preston said. "I hope you know that." "I do," Kade replied, putting his arm around Marion's shoulders. "I knew it from the first day she walked into my yard, exhausted from crossing the desert, and still had the courage to ask for work. She is the strongest person I know." Preston stayed for supper, sharing news from Tanapa and the surrounding ranches. The town was growing, he told them, with more mines opening and more people arriving every year. The wild days of the frontier were starting to fade, replaced by something more settled and civilized. After Preston left, Marion and Kade put the children to bed and sat together by the fire as they had done countless times over the years. "You think he was right?" Marion asked. "About the frontier days fading, maybe," Kade said thoughtfully. "Times change. But what we have here, this life we built that does not change, this is ours, no matter what happens in the world beyond these mountains." Marion leaned against him, feeling the solid strength of his body, the steady beat of his heart. "I am glad I walked into these mountains that day. I am glad I found you." "I am glad you found me too," Kade replied, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. "Best day of my life when you came walking into my yard looking for work." As the fire burned low and the night deepened around them, Marion thought about all the twists and turns that had brought her to this moment. The loss of her father, the struggle to survive, the crushing words from the foreman who said she was too weak. At the time, those had seemed like endings, like doors closing on her future. But they had actually been beginnings, paths leading her toward this life, this love, this home. The seasons continued their endless cycle. Kenneth grew tall and strong like his father, but he had his mother's gentle nature and her gift for seeing the world in shades of gray rather than black and white. Margaret developed into a spirited girl who loved the mountains as much as any of them, fearless in her exploration and endlessly curious about everything around her. When Marion was 32, she became pregnant once more. This pregnancy was harder than the previous two, perhaps because she was older now, perhaps simply because every pregnancy was different. But in the spring of 1891, she gave birth to twin boys they named Michael and Matthew. The twins were a handful from the start, always getting into mischief, always needing to be watched. But they filled the house with laughter and energy. The cabin had to be expanded again. Kade built a second floor, creating more bedrooms and a larger living space. What had started as a simple trapper's cabin had become a genuine homestead, a place where a family could grow and thrive. Kenneth, now 14, had become a real help around the ranch. He could handle most of the tasks that needed doing, and he had his father's skill with animals. Margaret, at 10, was equally capable in her own way, helping Marion with the younger children, working in the garden, and learning to cook and preserve food. The twins, at 4, were still too young for serious work, but they followed their older siblings around, trying to help and usually creating more chaos than actual assistance. One evening in late summer, the family gathered around the large table Kade had built for their expanding household. Marion looked around at her family, her heart swelling with love and gratitude. Kenneth was telling a story about a fox he had seen that day, using grand gestures that made Margaret giggle. The twins were listening with wide eyes, each trying to eat with one hand while holding on to their mother with the other. Kade sat at the head of the table, his blue eyes warm as he watched his children, occasionally meeting Marion's gaze across the table with a look that said he was thinking the same thing she was. How did we get so lucky? After the children were in bed, Marion and Kade stepped outside to enjoy the cool evening air. They stood close together, his arm around her waist, looking up at the stars scattered across the dark sky. 20 children or 20 stars, Kade murmured. I could not love you more. Marion laughed softly. Please, no more children. 4 is plenty. 4 is perfect, Kade agreed. Everything is perfect. You are perfect. I am far from perfect, Marion protested. I am tired most of the time. I have lost my temper with the twins at least twice today, and I burned the biscuits at breakfast. Perfect for me, Kade clarified, turning to face her. You are perfect for me, Marion Thorne. You always have been, from that first day when you showed up half dead from the desert, asking for work. I looked at you and thought, this woman has more courage than anyone I have ever met. And I was right. Marion reached up to cup his bearded face, which had more silver in it now than it had 15 years ago. The foreman said I was too weak for hard work, but you said my strength showed in other ways. You saw me, Kade, really saw me. That is what I fell in love with first, before anything else. You saw value in me when I could barely see it in myself. How could I not? Kade replied, covering her hand with his own. You walked into the mountains alone. You took a chance on a rough mountain man you did not know. You built a home out of nothing. You gave me children, a family, a reason to be more than just a man living alone in the wilderness. If that is not strength, I do not know what is. They kissed then, a long, deep kiss that held all the love and passion of their years together. When they finally pulled apart, Marion rested her head against Kade's broad chest, listening to his heartbeat, feeling utterly safe and utterly loved. The years continued to pass, bringing both joys and sorrows as all years do. Marion's health remained good, though she sometimes felt the toll of 4 pregnancies and years of hard work. Kade developed a slight limp from an old trapping accident, though he refused to slow down. The children grew and changed, each developing their own personalities and dreams. Kenneth, at 18, announced that he wanted to stay on the ranch and continue building it into something even greater. Marion and Kade were thrilled, grateful to have at least one child who wanted to maintain the legacy they had built. Margaret, at 14, had developed a talent for drawing and painting, creating beautiful images of the mountain landscape. She talked about maybe going to a city someday to study art, though she always added that she would come back to the mountains eventually. The twins, now 8, were inseparable and equally mischievous, keeping everyone on their toes. One fall afternoon, the entire family worked together to bring in the harvest from the expanded garden. It had been a good year, and they would have plenty of food to last through the winter. As Marion watched her family working side by side, laughing and talking, she felt a deep sense of peace. That evening, after another boisterous family dinner, Marion stepped outside for a moment of quiet. The sun was setting behind the mountains, painting everything in shades of gold and crimson. She heard the door open behind her and knew without looking that it was Kade. He wrapped his arms around her from behind, and she leaned back against him, marveling as always at how perfectly they fit together. "You remember the day we met?" Marion asked softly. "Every detail," Kade replied. "You were so thin, so tired, but your eyes were fierce. You were not going to give up no matter what. I knew right then that you were someone special." "I was terrified," Marion admitted. "I thought you might turn me away and I had nowhere else to go, but you gave me a chance." "You gave me everything. We gave each other everything," Kade corrected. "I was half alive before you came, Marion, just existing, not really living. You changed all that. You made me whole." Marion turned in his arms to face him. "I love you, Kade Thorne. I will love you until my last breath and beyond. And I love you, Marion Thorne. You are my heart, my home, my everything." They stood together as the sun completed its descent and the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. From inside the cabin came the sounds of their children, their voices raised in laughter and argument and all the noisy chaos of family life. It was perfect. It was home. The winters grew a little easier as the children got older, and could help more with the endless tasks of surviving in the mountains. The summers brought more travel, with trips to Tanapa, and occasionally even to larger towns where Margaret could get art supplies and Kenneth could trade the furs and hides they produced. The twins started school in Tanapa, boarding with a family during the week and coming home on weekends, a compromise that allowed them an education while still keeping them connected to the ranch. Marion, now in her early 40s, sometimes felt the weight of years and hard work in her bones. But she also felt a deep satisfaction with the life she had built. She had proven wrong everyone who ever said she was too weak, not by becoming physically stronger, but by finding and using the strengths she already possessed. One spring morning, Marion was working in the garden when she heard horses approaching. She stood, shading her eyes against the sun, and was surprised to see a group of women riding toward the homestead. As they drew closer, she recognized several of them from Tanapa and the surrounding ranches. The lead rider was a woman named Elizabeth Carson, who ran a ranch with her husband to the south of Kade and Marion's homestead. "Mrs. Thorne," Elizabeth called out as she dismounted, "I hope you will forgive us for arriving unannounced." "Of course," Marion said, wiping her hands on her apron. "What brings you all here?" "We wanted to talk to you about starting a women's cooperative," Elizabeth explained. "We have been discussing it for months, and your name keeps coming up. You are something of a legend among the mountain families, Mrs. Thorne. The woman who came to the mountains alone and built a thriving ranch with her husband. We thought if anyone could help us organize a way for the women in this area to support each other, share resources, and build something lasting, it would be you." Marion was stunned. "I am honored, but I am not sure I am the right person. I am just a wife and mother. I do not have any special skills or knowledge." "That is where you are wrong," another woman spoke up. Marion recognized her as Sarah Mitchell, who lived even further up in the mountains with her family. "You have exactly the skills we need. You know how to make something out of nothing. You know how to survive and thrive in difficult circumstances. You understand that strength comes in many forms." Marion felt tears prick her eyes. These women saw her the way Kade had always seen her, as someone valuable and capable. "All right," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I would be honored to help. Come inside and we can discuss your ideas." The women's cooperative became a significant part of Marion's life over the following years. They shared resources, knowledge, and support. When someone was sick, the others would help with tasks. When someone needed supplies, others would contribute what they could. They taught each other skills, from preserving food to treating illnesses to managing livestock. It was everything Marion had discovered about finding strength in community and mutual support, formalized and expanded. Kenneth married at 20 to a young woman from Tanapa named Lucy, who fit into the mountain life as if she had been born to it. They built their own cabin on the far side of Kade and Marion's property, expanding the family ranch. Within a year, they welcomed a daughter, making Marion and Kade grandparents for the first time. Margaret did eventually go to San Francisco to study art, but true to her word, she returned after 2 years. She had sold several paintings and made enough money to fund her travels, but she missed the mountains. She missed her family. Within 6 months of returning, she married a photographer who had come west to document the changing frontier, and together they created stunning images and paintings of mountain life. The twins, now young men of 18, had different dreams. Michael wanted to become a doctor and moved to a larger town to pursue his education. Matthew stayed on the ranch, working alongside Kenneth and their father. The family remained close despite the distances, gathering together for holidays and important occasions. Marion and Kade, now in their 50s, began to slow down slightly, though neither would admit it. They let the younger generation take on more of the heavy work, though both still contributed in important ways. Kade still checked traps and hunted, though not as far into the mountains as he once had. Marion still managed the household and worked with the women's cooperative, her organizational skills and wisdom valued by all. One winter evening, as they sat by the fire in the cabin that had been their home for so many years, Marion looked over at Kade and saw him watching her with the same expression of love and wonder he had worn when they first married. "What are you thinking?" she asked. "I am thinking about the day you arrived here," Kade said. "I am thinking about how my life was divided into before that day and after. Everything good in my life, everything that matters, came from you walking into my yard and asking for work." Marion smiled. "You gave me a chance when no one else would. You saw strength in me where others saw only weakness. You changed my life, Kade. You saved my life." "We saved each other," Kade said firmly. "I was existing, not living. You taught me the difference. You taught me about love and family and what really matters." "The foreman said I was too weak for hard work," Marion said softly, remembering that long-ago day that had set everything in motion. "But you said my strength showed in other ways." "You were right, Kade. My strength was not in lifting heavy things or doing back-breaking labor. My strength was in surviving, in adapting, in building a life and a family, in loving you." "Your strength was and is in being exactly who you are," Kade replied. "You never needed to be anything other than Marion Wells and now Marion Thorne. That was always enough, more than enough, everything." They sat in comfortable silence, hands clasped, watching the fire burn down to embers. Outside, snow began to fall, blanketing the mountains in white. Inside, they were warm and safe, surrounded by the life they had built together. The years continued their march, bringing more grandchildren, more changes, more joys and sorrows. Marion's hair turned silver and Kade's beard went completely white. Their bodies grew slower, their steps more careful. But their love remained as strong as ever, perhaps even stronger for having weathered decades of life together. On a spring morning in 1910, Marion and Kade celebrated their 48th wedding anniversary. Their children and grandchildren gathered at the ranch for a large celebration. Kenneth and Lucy, still running the ranch with their grown children helping, organized the whole event. Margaret and her husband came from Tonopah, where they now ran a successful gallery. Michael arrived from Carson City, where he was a respected doctor. Matthew and his wife, who lived in the cabin he had built just up the canyon, were there with their large brood of children. As Marion looked around at all the people who had come from her and Kade, all the love that had grown from that single moment when a desperate woman had walked into a mountain man's yard and asked for work, she felt overwhelmed with gratitude. "Speech." Someone called out and others took up the cry. "Speech." Marion looked at Kade, who nodded encouragingly. She stood, feeling the weight of her years but also the strength that had never left her, the strength that Kade had recognized all those decades ago. "I am not good with speeches," she began, and several people laughed. "But I do want to say something. 48 years ago I came to these mountains because I had nowhere else to go. I had been told I was too weak for hard work and I believed it. I thought I had nothing to offer the world. But a wise man saw me differently. He saw strength in me where I could not see it in myself. He gave me a chance, and in doing so he gave me everything. A home, a family, a life filled with love and meaning. Kade Thorne, you are the best man I have ever known, and I thank God every day that I walked into your yard all those years ago." Kade stood and pulled her into his arms, holding her as their family applauded. When he spoke, his voice was rough with emotion. "Marion Thorne, you are the strongest person I have ever met. Your strength was never about lifting heavy loads or doing back-breaking work. Your strength is in your heart, your courage, your love. You took a lonely mountain man and taught him what family means. You built something lasting and beautiful. I am the lucky one, Marion. I always have been." They kissed, and their family cheered. The celebration continued into the evening with music and dancing and more food than anyone could possibly eat. Marion danced with Kade, moving slowly to accommodate their aging bodies, but the love between them was as young and vital as ever. Late that night, after everyone had left or gone to bed, Marion and Kade sat on the porch of their cabin, looking up at the stars. 48 years, Marion said wonderingly. Where did they go? Into everything around us, Kade replied, gesturing at the darkened ranch, the other cabins where their children slept, the mountains rising black against the starry sky. Every moment we lived, every choice we made, it all went into building this, and it was worth it. Every hard day, every struggle, every moment of doubt, all worth it. Yes, Marion agreed, leaning against his shoulder, all worth it. They sat in peaceful silence, two people who had found each other against all odds, who had built a life together in the wilderness, who had proven that strength came in many forms and love could conquer any challenge. When Kade finally stood and offered Marion his hand, she took it and let him help her up. They walked into the cabin together, as they had done thousands of times before, as they would do for whatever time they had left. The door closed behind them, shutting out the mountain night, enclosing them in warmth and love and home. Marion and Kade lived several more good years together, surrounded by family and the life they had built. When Marion was 69, she died peacefully in her sleep, with Kade holding her hand. The entire community mourned the loss of a woman who had touched so many lives, who had shown that strength was not just about physical power, but about courage, determination, and love. Kade lived for 2 more years after Marion's death, long enough to see that the ranch and family they had built would continue to thrive. He spent his final years sharing stories with his grandchildren and great-grandchildren, making sure they understood the legacy their grandmother had left behind. When Kade died at 72, he was buried next to Marion on a hillside overlooking the ranch, with a view of the mountains they had both loved so much. The headstone read simply, "Marion and Kade Thorne. Together they built a life. Together they rest." And so the story ended as all stories must, with death and loss. But it was not a sad ending, because what Marion and Kade had created lived on. The ranch thrived under Kenneth's care and was eventually passed down to his children and then their children. The women's cooperative that Marion had helped establish continued for decades, providing support and community to mountain families. Margaret's paintings hung in galleries and homes across the West, capturing the beauty of the mountains her parents had loved. But more than any of that, Marion and Kade's legacy lived on in the very idea they had embodied. That strength comes in many forms, that everyone has value if someone will just see it, and that love can transform lives in ways both large and small. The foreman had said Marion was too weak for hard work. The mountain man had said her strength showed in other ways, and in the end, the mountain man had been right. Marion's strength, the strength she brought to her marriage, her family, and her community, was the kind that lasted, the kind that built legacies, the kind that really mattered. And they lived, loved, and built something beautiful together, which is all anyone can really hope for in this brief, precious life.